Hello and welcome everyone to Interview Tips and Trends. My name is Nick. I will be your instructor for this online workshop, and let's get started right away. So first and foremost, I always like to play a little experiment. Now obviously, given that this is an online workshop, this will work a little differently than I typically run it, but I'll explain it just the same. Now imagine if I showed you this person and asked you just to tell me about her. You don't know this person, you've never met this person or anything, how would you describe her? You might describe her as being happy or jovial or overall approachable. And, I might ask you, would you be interested in talking to someone like this person here? And most likely the answer might be yes. That's kind of how this experiment is supposed to run. So let's look at some other people before the experiment's kind of over. Next we have this gentleman. Now, take some time, think of what, you might take from this gentleman's expression here. Some of you might say he looks stressed out because he's kind of grabbing at his tie there, which is a very common thing to do when one is stressed, should you wear ties. Might say he looks a little worried, a little preoccupied. Would you want to talk to the person? Maybe not. Let's do a couple more. This person here, they look pretty happy as well. Sometimes this person does get that they might be hard to read. They might be professional, but overall, seems content. Let's do one more. This last gentleman here, usually this gentleman gets the response of he either looks preoccupied again, or arrogant, or cocky, or overly confident, or just not zeroed in on what we're doing here. Now, what is the purpose of this little experiment that I'm doing here? Well, typically, as I said, when I do this workshop in person, I usually get these kinds of responses. And again, anyone I give this to, any of you watching this video, you've never met these people before. These are just simply stock images I pulled off the internet. So what's the purpose of it? Well, if we thought that about these people, and we all make these same or similar kinds of impressions simply based on an image, no movement, no sound, no smell, no nothing, just simply a static image, why would an interviewer not respond the same way? Why would an interviewer not look at you when you walk into the door, when you walk into that interview room and say, that person looks really arrogant, or that person looks really stressed out, or that person looks really jovial? Why wouldn't the interviewer, make that initial first impression? And first impressions are ever so important when it comes to an interview, and that's why I really like to do this little experiment here, to really drive that point home. So really think about an interview as the ultimate first impression. That whole time you're giving off that first impression of how you may be as a possible employee. So you really want to think about all these little minor details that go into making a good first impression. And that's what we'll talk a lot about today when it comes to the topic of interviewing. But in particular, we'll be going over these 5 basic areas today. We'll kind of go in a sort of chronological order when it comes to interviewing. We'll talk about what we want to do with research and other stuff before the interview. We'll also talk about stuff we want to do during the interview, including some of those tough interview questions. And of course, things will follow up after the interview. But that first big one there is research. So how can we break this down here? Here's a nice little flow chart, if you will, of the research you may want to do. So I'm going to break down block by block how we want to go about this. First and foremost, one of the obvious ones is going directly to the company website. A lot of that basic information that you really want to know about the company is going to be situated on this website. So you really want to read the website up and down. Ideally, what you want to look for is their mission statement, their culture, and their values. Typically, these items are all organized under one section or page or tab, whatever it might be. You really want to ideally know this before you get to the point of interview, but certainly if you have an interview, this is something that you should really take to heart concretely. Because during the interview, they're going to ask you questions to see if your ethics, your morals, your beliefs, if those things line up with what they're looking for in their employees, if they line up with their mission statement, with their values, with their culture. So you really want to have a good understanding of what that company is looking for when it comes to these items. So you really want to, know that concretely. You almost know the mission statement by heart. So when you start to ask you some of those more, culture or company related items, you're ready and prepared to answer them. And of course, we have the client's products and services. Certainly, you don't want to walk into an interview and say, hey, what do you guys do? You should know that before the interview actually happens. So you really want to know this in detail. I always say to people, do a lot of extra research when you get to this point. We know that Target is a retail store. We know that Starbucks sells coffee. We know that Amazon does online deliveries. What else does Amazon do? What else does Starbucks do? What else does Target do? How do they do it? Why do they do it? Who do they do it for? You really want to think of all this extra information. And the reason why I say that is that an interviewer is likely not going to ask you, what is our target demographic for this product and this product line? Probably not in most cases, unless your job is uber specific where it deals with that sort of thing. However, having that information on hand, readily available in your head, will make you the more detailed candidate, which really comes to show in something like an interview. An interviewer is very good at discerning, between a candidate who did the basic amount of research just to understand the company and get by the interview, between someone who really understands the company, really wants to work for them, and really knows all that information by heart. You really want to be in the latter category, those people who know the information by heart, who really want to work for the company, who keep up to date with the company, and have concrete reasons as to why they want to work for them. So even circling back to our prior conversation about mission statements, values, and culture, this idea plays into it too. Simply just knowing all the extra details that you can about a company will simply just make you the more detailed candidate. And even to circle back once again on mission statement, culture, and values is to talk about our social media. So social media is changing our lives in more ways than one. Certainly the interview process has been affected by it as well. Social media is going to be a very, very helpful research tool when it comes to this information about culture. Social media is a great marketing platform, a great recruiting platform, but it's also a place where companies are going to, give their public perception of their company. And so you can glean a lot of helpful cultural information about the company. What kind of things are they posting? Are they posting information about their employees, their teams, maybe the outings they're doing, maybe the volunteer work they're doing? Or are they posting stuff about the company itself, the figures of growth, the revenue, all this other statistical information? What kind of things are they posting? And that idea, the tonal messaging of the posting, will give you an idea of how the interviewers may act. Certainly, this will not always be a one-to-one comparison, especially with larger companies with different regional cultures, but it can give you a good idea nonetheless. So, for example, let's say you go on a company's social media site and you see all these, more uplifting posts. They're more jovial in nature. Maybe they're playing in some of the social media tropes that are very common nowadays. Maybe they're more about their employees and what they're doing and less about the actual business itself. You can probably extrapolate that the interviewer will probably match the tone of that posting. Their energy, their demeanor will probably match the tone of that posting. Again, certainly every interviewer could be different. Every region can be different. Every location can be different. So it's not always going to be a one-to-one comparison, but it's more of a possible heads up, if you will. So I do highly, highly, highly recommend looking into the social media for that reason. Another big reason, if we circle onto that very last tip real quick, the recent events and news, this can give you an idea of what they've been doing recently. Again, an interviewer is very good at discerning a well-prepared candidate to a candidate who's done the baseline amount of research. And typically those candidates who don't do a lot of research past the baseline don't really care to see what they've been doing recently in the news, recently in the media, recently with their company. Really make sure you have a good idea of what they've been doing and keep that knowledge updated. Certainly don't stop on the day you're doing your research. Follow them on those social media sites, on Facebook, on LinkedIn, on Twitter, on Instagram, on YouTube, whatever they have. Follow them and see what they've been doing. Watch some videos, read some articles they post, whatever they post, read it. Get to know it. You want to work for this company, you have to know the company in order to prove that to the employer. So definitely research that quite a bit. Next, we have information regarding salary of those three websites there, Glassdoor.com, Indeed.com, and Salary.com. So this is also something that might have been helpful to be done before the interview, but it's okay to do it at this point as well. You want to do some salary research. You want to have a good idea of what you're looking for in a salary or a wage. You really don't want to go at this guessing. When you get that question posed to you, what are your salary requirements? You really want to avoid saying just negotiable. Negotiable typically leads to one or two bad thoughts in the recruiter's mind. Either one, this person is one of those baseline researchers, or they haven't done a lot of research past that normal amount of research. Or two, this person simply has a salary that is way too high and I don't think I can pay it. I might pass by this person altogether. So that's why you really want to do extensive salary research and really understand, what's going on with the field you're in, the industry you're in, the location you're in, all those other things in there. Hopefully at some point the salary workshop will be up and running on the website here, but for now, please feel free to use the handout that explains everything quite well. It gives you all these websites, as including some others, as you do that salary research. But essentially, in a nutshell, you want to present a range. Again, whether it's a salary or an hourly wage, whatever you have, present a range to an employer and make sure that range is realistic. Don't make it too broad where it's something like $30,000 to $60,000. It's a lot of space in between. We can't really work with that. But also don't make it too narrow. $30,000 to $32,000 is also not going to work. That's too tight of a range for the employer to work in. You want to have some room for negotiation. You want to have some room in there so the interviewer and you can sort of duke it out in that negotiation period. One thing I want to stress, and I'll say this again as we move forward here, is that during the interview, you are not the one to bring up the question of salary. You want to have this information prepared and ready to go in the back of your mind, but you are not the one to bring the information up. You wait for the interviewer to bring the information up, unless it gets to the point of offer and no mention of salary has been made. Now, that's a very abnormal situation that probably is not going to happen, but that's the only time you would bring it up before they would. So really just have it prepared to go, prepared when the interviewer actually decides to bring it up. The other big thing is networking and LinkedIn and your personal and professional network. So if you're unaware, LinkedIn is the largest social media networking site for professionals. A good way to think of it about it is kind of like professional Facebook, where Facebook is for your friends and family and your personal life. LinkedIn is for your colleagues, coworkers, and your professional life. And LinkedIn, in addition to your personal network and your professional network, people you know within your industry or your friends and family, for example, can be excellent resources for an interview, especially when it comes to research, because maybe you know someone, or they know someone, or your friend knows someone, or your sister knows someone, or whoever knows someone that's been through the interview process you're about to go into. Maybe that is the case. Maybe you should look into talking to some of those people. They can give you ideas of what questions they're going to ask, how the interviewers were, what they wore, all these other things that you might not be able to get from basic research or even extensive research. Certainly when it comes to those questions, the big kahuna of any interview is the difficult questions. So definitely reach out to people on LinkedIn, on your social media, through your professional works, make some calls, send some emails, send some texts, ask around anything. You never know what you're going to find until you actually start asking around. Industry research will serve the same kind of purpose as the client's product and services. We don't really need to know every single last thing about the industry we're working in, especially if we've been working in for some time. But if you are going into a new industry, certainly you want to learn a lot about it before the interview. And even generally, you just want to learn a lot about it in general, because again, this is going to make you the more detailed candidate and gives you more room to talk. Another big issue of interviews is sometimes people run out of things to say, so you never want that to happen to you and end up in that deer in the headlights situation where you don't know what you're going to say to this person in the next step here. Definitely do some industry research, get a good idea of what the industry looks like in that area you're working in, what the industry work looks like with competitors and other partners, and what information might be relevant to the interview. And lastly, as I already mentioned, with recent events and news, we definitely want to look into this quite a bit and see what kind of things we can talk about and bring up in the interview to show the interviewer that we've been kept up to snuff of what they've been doing. So definitely look into this interview stuff here. There's quite a bit of information in that packet on the research bit. Okay, some other important research tips that I might have alluded to, but definitely want to mention in specifics. First and foremost, if you go onto any of those websites that have different company reviews, like Glassdoor and Indeed, for example, have reviews from current and past employees of any company, look for the patterns in those reviews. I think a lot of people take those really positive or really negative reviews at face value, and they take them for what they are, and they don't really think about all the extraneous information that goes with that. A really negative review, a really positive review is written out of a lot of emotion, and while certainly everything they are saying in that review could be 100% true, we do have to remind ourselves that this is written out of emotion. We may have to take it with a bit of a grain of salt. For example, let's take a really negative review. That person is likely just leaving the company, just left, got laid off or fired, or whatever might have happened, And maybe they have every, hateful word to say about the company. Certainly, again, everything they're saying could be 100% true, but we do have that lens of the review being written through that negative mindset. And even the same thing goes for a positive review. Positive reviews are great to see, but maybe that person's in the first couple of months of their job. They're still in that honeymoon period of their new job, and they're still, all starry-eyed about everything. They're enjoying everything just yet. Maybe they haven't seen all the kinks that the job has, because certainly, people can love their jobs, but every job does become a job at some point. There are things about every job that some people just simply don't like, and that's okay. That's normal. So you really want to take those things with a grain of salt. Certainly I'll read all the reviews that you can, but I like to look for things that are commonly being said. What are those common denominator items across every review I'm reading? That's really what I'm going to pay a little more stock to when I read those kind of reviews. Whenever we're reviewing social media, we always want to be careful of anything that looks a little unmanaged or inconsistent. With the advent of social media and how important it's come to our world, companies that are going to use social media in their business are going to put a lot of stock into it and put a lot of money and time and human capital into that social media to make sure it looks nice and pristine when something is put out. And so if anything looks, off or fishy or funny or just, anything's grammatically incorrect, or the postings all over the place, maybe they're posting, twice 1 month and not posting for 3 months and then 3 times that month, whatever might happen there. That's where some of those red flags start to pop up. Maybe this isn't a company that is as legitimate as it seems. Maybe something's going on behind the scenes that I don't really see as a candidate. I don't know. So just be careful of anything that is a little off. Use your better judgment, especially when going to company websites. Make sure the website is safe in its own right to go on. Make sure the social media looks like a real company's social media. We talked about establishing that salary range. Certainly we're going to go over this a little more detail in later, and there's more detail in the handout attached to this PowerPoint. And make sure you're starting to write down questions as you're researching. Certainly this is a super important step, because at the end of the interview, this is what you're going to be doing. You're going to be asking them questions you have about their company. And you really don't want these questions to be simple yes or no answer questions or one-word answer questions or anything else of that sort. You really want these questions to be something that only a company employee could answer. So certainly if you come across anything in your research that you can't seem to answer, you can't find their website or their social media or different articles or publications about them, maybe that's something to write down. And why am I saying specifically write it down at this point? Well, when you get to your interview, you're likely to be very nervous and you're likely to be more forgetful of certain things. So write it down, have it stored away, get it ready to go. Alright, so next we want to think about what we are going to bring to a job interview. What kind of things do you think you usually bring to a job interview? Let's get this stuff sorted out. First and foremost, let's just kind of break down this list. So we definitely want to bring 5 copies of a resume and 5 copies of our reference sheet. If you watched the resume video already, or if you've been to my class before, you know that these 2 documents should be separate. So 5 and 5, not one resume and one reference, not one document altogether, but 5 copies of a resume, 5 copies of a reference sheet. This is helpful in case, they decide to add an intern or a new employee or a supervisor or anything into the interview that may want to sit in for whatever reason. Certainly they'll have your resume on file, but maybe they don't have the time to print it out necessarily. This is a great way to hand that off to people to show that you've become extra prepared. The reference sheet, too, is helpful because maybe they're really impressed and you do a great job of the interview and they say, okay, well, great. Next step, we want to contact some of your references. If you can save 2-3 days worth of time just by simply saying, hey, I have my reference sheet right here, I can give this to you right now, that is so good for your candidacy. So definitely have your references prepared well before an interview. We also want to bring a pen and notepad. Typically, if we bring something like a Padfolio, which is another huge thing we want to bring, we don't want to bring a simple manila or 5-star folder or anything like that. We want to bring a leather or pleather-bound Padfolio, something that's going to look nice and professional. And one of the things we're going to want in there is a pen and notepad. Typically, a lot of these Padfolios come with these things, but we definitely want to have one just in case. And this is helpful for taking any sort of notes, especially during the interview. Anything you want to write down for later or, copy down for yourself, simply having that there is extremely helpful. And of course, on that pen and notepad, some things we may actually write down before the interview are the questions we want to ask. We just talked about how we want to write those things down in particular, so maybe you should make it easy on yourself and simply write down those questions in your Padfolio so they're ready to go on the day of the interview, and so you don't forget any questions that you have that you might be nervous. Examples of past work is something I always like to hit on specifically. I think this really helped me in a lot of my past interviews where I brought in different examples of curriculum and different workshops I've created in the past for other volunteer works and work sites and all that fun stuff. So I really think that if you can bring in some sort of example of your work, definitely do that, because it's going to be able to give something tangible to the employer to show what work you've done. And you can think a lot of different ways around this. Certainly not everyone works on files and documents and curriculum and things of that nature that you can bring in just paper. Sometimes people work in a lot of different settings or environments where you can't exactly, drag it in. If you're a truck driver, you can't really drive your truck into the interview or anything like that. So think of different ways around this. I've heard of people using pictures, taking pictures of things you worked on. For example, I always give is that I once had a gentleman in this class where he was a network administrator working on the internet framework of a organization, and he simply took pictures of the kinds of servers that he worked on, and with some extraneous documents related to those things, and that really helped him in his candidacy, as he told me. And so definitely think of ways around that, examples of past work idea. Certainly when any certifications, work permits, photo ID, any of those identification documents, anything related to that, we want that ready to go in case the interviewer wants to see any of that for an application or anything. Breath mints. Why breath mints? It's a silly question, has a silly answer. You don't want smelly breath. Certainly interviews are very close affairs. You'll be, maybe not right now, but hopefully if things come back to a sense of normalcy, you'll be meeting face-to-face with some people in the future. So you want to make sure that you have, the appropriate way to deal with any breath you might have. And name and phone number of the interviewer. There's typically two reasons as to why I want to point this out. First and foremost, the obvious one, you want to know who you're talking to. You want to know what name you can give the person at the front desk or greeting you when they ask you who you're here to see. The other big reason as to why we want this information prepared is that, let's say you're driving along to your interview, well, maybe not again not nowadays, but just for me, for example, and you're going along, you're having a good time, and maybe, unfortunately someone backs into the interview. You can't really leave a situation like that. So you really want to be able to call that person, let them know if something happened, or if any other sort of emergency happened. Maybe you're getting ready for the interview, and then you have some sort of medical emergency or family emergency. You simply can't make it during the scheduled day and time, and you don't have time to, reschedule beforehand. Definitely call them and let them know. Don't leave them, in that limbo area thinking if you're going to come or not, or thinking that you just didn't come at all. Try to let them know as best you can. Typically, whenever I have an interview, I have it as a temporary contact my phone. I put that person's name and phone number as a temporary contact my phone, so I don't have to, scour through my email or look for the one sheet I printed out or one sheet I've written on. I have it right then and there, right there in my phone. So we talked about the things that we're going to bring. Now let's talk about some of the things we don't want to bring into an interview. First and foremost, cell phones or electronic devices, primarily nowadays smartwatches. Again, we don't want these things going off during any sort of interview, whether it be over a computer or in person. It's just going to be overall annoying, so make sure you do turn those things off, and make sure you turn them off entirely. Don't just put them to vibrate, because that vibrate will make a noise, especially if someone calls you, or if, God forbid, you get 1,000 texts or anything like that. Really watch that right there. We also want to bring other people. Again, maybe not as likely at the moment, but we definitely want to bring other people into an interview. Anyone else. They're not going to hire anyone else. They're going to hire you, hopefully. Don't bring any other people. It's definitely going to hurt your candidacy if you have someone waiting out in the lobby for you. So if you are, someone who doesn't drive, for example, have someone drop you off and pick you up later. Don't have them sit in the lobby. Don't have them sit out there in their car. Come back around or take a block or whatever it might be before the interview is over. Cigarettes. Well, we always say that do not smoke for 4 hours before the interviews. That cigarette smell might kind of linger on you, and that might be somewhat offensive to certain interviewers, and we definitely do not want that to happen during the interviews. Definitely watch that cigarette smoke. The same thing goes with perfume or cologne. A little spritz of that stuff is okay, but too much is going to be overbearing, and is going to distract the interviewer from your overall good answers. And definitely with either of these things, avoid putting it on your actual interview wardrobe, whatever that may be. Definitely watch that quite a bit. Excessive jewelry, we certainly don't want to jingle everywhere we walk, so definitely watch that jewelry. We don't want anything that's too big or too distracting or anything like that. Definitely watch with anything like large earrings or bracelets or a lot of rings or necklaces or anything of that nature. The same thing goes with piercings and tattoos. Now, luckily, we do live in society today that's a little more accepting of these things in the workplace, but we're never going to fully know a company's culture before we actually meet them and are inside their building or their facility. So we certainly want to, if we have a lot of these things, either cover them up to the best of our ability or take some of those things out before or for the interview, I should say. Flashy clothing. I'll talk about clothing in the next slide in more detail, but this really comes down to the idea that we don't really want anything too bright or too patternistic. Gum, we want breath mints, not gum. Chewing gum is often, rude in most cases, and we really just want to deal with the aftermath of chewing gum. Mints will dissipate nicely, gum stays as it is. And then coffee and soda. We don't want any of that coffee breath, that soda breath, and it's a little inappropriate to bring something like a soda bottle, for example, or a cup of coffee from a Starbucks, for example, into an interview. Typically it's not something that is wholly appropriate to do. And then at this point, I usually get a couple questions, Nick, can I bring a water bottle to an interview? Either a refillable plastic one or one of the standard use, single-use ones. And typically I say no, it's not really a good idea. And why is that? Water doesn't leave any sort of breath on you or anything like that. Why can I not bring a water bottle to an interview? Well, it's merely because it's just going to weigh you down, essentially. You don't want to have this thing that's an extra thing to carry, especially when you're so worried about your presentation, that first impression idea. You don't have to bring it along with you. And so we really just want to avoid that for that sake in particular. Typically they're going to offer you water or tea anyway, so there's no reason to bring a water bottle with you. So really think about what you want to bring. Again, on that last note, we want to be packed as light as we can be, just to move as swiftly as we can. I typically only bring a portfolio with me to an interview. I'll have my phone on me, but I'll turn it off. But I won't bring much else past that. For anyone who might be using a purse, I would recommend a purse that is easy to sling on your shoulder, but nothing that's too big. I wouldn't recommend a huge bag purse that might get in the way when you put it down. I also want to recommend a wristlet, those little things that go around your wrists and you put your wallet in. Unless you can comfortably fit that in your portfolio, I wouldn't bring that. I think that's a little too much. You're going to have to set it on the table because you can't really set it on the back of a chair or anything like that. I think it's a little too much. Now, that works for you. Certainly, it's not something that I typically use, but it's just something I noticed that in the past that is a little too much in some cases. So something like a smaller purse or any messenger bag is more appropriate. Alright, so what are we going to wear for the job interview? Across the board, a suit is always the safest idea. Now, I will caveat this by saying that it depends on what kind of position you're interviewing for. Certainly, if you work in a position where you're going to be working in a warehouse or a factory or a plant, or you're going to be wearing steel-toed boots, or you're going to be whatever, in a more production, manufacturing, transportation-oriented field, a suit's probably not the best idea in that case. You really want to, dress appropriate to the culture. So really think about what job you're going into, what interview you're going into. Is a suit the best idea for that job? Maybe not. If not, a collared shirt or a nice blouse with appropriate pants, appropriate slacks is probably the best way to go for those of you who aren't going into something where you're going to be wearing a suit and tie or a shirt and tie or blazer and pencil skirt every day. Of course, with colors, we want to keep colors pretty conservative. Navy blue, black, gray, whites, light blues, maybe light pinks. But that's about our sort of repertoire when it comes to colors in most cases. With ties, we want to make sure those ties are ideally solid ties. We want to avoid something that's too patternistic. If I can see it from across the room, it's way too patternistic. So avoid that altogether. The same thing goes with any scarves you might wear. If you wear a scarf, I would recommend a solid color scarf that goes nicely with what you're wearing. Anything that's too patternistic can be otherwise distracting. For all of my women who might wear skirts or dresses, make sure those are appropriate length, so not too short, not too long. The rule is if you stand up and put your index finger on your side of your pants, it should be an inch past your index finger at the shortest, essentially. So certainly don't want anything of that nature. Make sure your shoes are polished, because there's a surprising amount of interviewers who look at the backs of your shoes when you leave an interview. I know it sounds kind of odd, but that is a statistical average and plays in that first impression idea we talked about earlier. So make sure you have those polished shoes ready to go. If you're going to wear heels, I would recommend short heels. Ideally, I'd recommend something like a flat or another appropriate shoe of that nature that's a little easier to walk in. Make sure your hairstyle is neat and clean. Make sure any facial you have is groomed and appropriate. Make sure any makeup you wear is subtle and your jewelry is, like we mentioned earlier, not too excessive. Another quick note about dress is the idea of colors. Different colors will say different things about you. This is where that's going to come into play. This is more of a fun slide to break up the interview information, and certainly not something that's going to be the end-all, be-all, but something just to give you an idea of what color psychology is all about. So red conveys energy, passion, courage. It's usually known as the sort of attractive color. You might see a lot of public figures and politicians, for example, wearing red ties or red blazers or anything of that nature, because it kind of drags your eye to them. Is that red color? That's what it does. So it is helpful for that. Blue, ideally navy blue, conveys feelings of calm, trust, confidence, cooperation. It's usually a person's favorite color at sometimes too. So sometimes someone may like you before they even meet you if you're wearing a lot of blue. Black is known as sort of the leadership color. So if you're looking for something like in a manager position or leader position or a supervisor position, maybe wearing a black suit, black blazer, black pants might be a good idea, because it has that sort of authority-like idea to it. Gray is good for people in fields like analytics or supply chain or project management or accounting or anything that deals with numbers or inventory management. Anything that deals with that logical, analytical nature, because that's what it sort of is conveying, is that independent, self-sufficient, analytically, logically natured idea. Brown is great for some of those customer service or retail or healthcare environments, because it conveys feelings of calm or trust, dependability, safety, reliability, warmth. I wouldn't wear a brown or tan suit, for example. Probably not the best idea, but a touch of brown in your wardrobe might be helpful, especially for those of you going into something like the food industry or the healthcare industry or the hospitality industry, anything of that nature. And again, will wearing a red tie to an interview or a red suit or a blue dress, or will this get you a job? No. Again, this is simply things to think about extra if you really wanted to get that specific with it. All right, so we've done our research, we've packed our bag, we have our wardrobe ready to go. What's our next step? Well, our next step is to do a test run of our route. Again, this might not be as relevant right at this moment in this time of social distancing, but we do want to know what this is going to be. Now, this can turn into something different with this time of social distancing, especially if a lot of companies are doing more, as I call them, Skype interviews at this point. We have to do the interview over the computer. A different version of this is to run your own computer, your laptop, whatever you're using, your tablet, your phone. Make sure that's all in working order. You really don't want to get to the interview the day of and find out, oh no, my laptop doesn't have Skype, or oh no, I can't connect to the team meeting to talk to the interviewer, or oh no, so on and so forth. Figure that stuff out beforehand. But if you were driving to the interview, the other thing you want to do is just make sure you know where it is. Certainly if you are going to drive somewhere for an interview, you want to know what it is beforehand. So you want to practice your commute around the same time of day you would practice your commute for the actual interview. So let's just say, for example, your interview is Thursday at 11 o'clock. And you think you're going to leave your house at 10:30 to get there with 15 minutes to spare. What you should do on Wednesday or Tuesday or Monday is leave your house at 10:30 and drive to the interview location to see how long it takes you to get there. Now, why are you doing it specifically at that time? Well, you want to know the commute, what that will look like, what the traffic patterns, the delays, construction, all that fun stuff we'll look at that at a time, because certainly driving somewhere at 9 o'clock at night will be a lot quicker than driving somewhere at 10:30 in the morning. So you definitely want to practice your commute right away. So think of those two ideas of either practicing your commute or making sure all your technology things are put into place, or your phone or your laptop or your computer. Make sure that's all put into place before the interview That's something we don't need to worry about or shouldn't be worrying about the day of the interview when we have other things to worry about, like the questions in the interview or how they're going to ask all that fun stuff. All right. So again, in this time of social distancing, this might be a little different, but what begins when you are on company property or when you're essentially starting up that interview? Well, the interview begins. You want to watch some of these other things that might be more relevant in a time of not social distancing, but certainly when it comes to things like a Skype call or a FaceTime interview or anything of that nature, a phone interview, you want to make sure that there's no extraneous sounds around you, or there's no, if it's a Skype call, you would have a neutral background, nothing really going on, maybe just a blank wall in your home, for example. Make sure your pets or children or loved ones or whoever aren't running around, walking behind you in the frame or anything like that. Make sure you do it in a quiet place where no one's going to bother you for the duration of the interview. So really watch these things when you're actually in that interview right then and there. Certainly, again, this is not maybe as relevant, but just to get it out of the way, if we are actually going to a place for an interview, if we're waiting in a lobby, some things we definitely want to think about. Make sure we're very kind, courteous, and direct to that receptionist person, whoever that might be, that front desk person, administrative assistant, whoever it might be, because that person may have more leeway than we initially think they have. That person is certainly the one to call or to page or to get the interviewer, and they're probably going to give their own little impression of you. Oh, Nick came in, he was acting a little odd, I'm not sure how about this guy. And now that interviewer already has a negative impression of me just based on the way I treated the receptionist, treated the front desk person. So really watch, that. Make sure you're very kind and courteous to that person. Tell them directly who you are, tell them directly who you're here to see, and all that other detail. Make sure if you're sitting in that lobby, set your back straight. A lot of people tend to start to lean in a lot of those, waiting area chairs. So make sure you watch that. Don't lean. Always look professional when you're waiting for an interview. Make sure you avoid having too many items on your lap in order to get up gracefully. And especially if you are waiting or if you're having something like a coat or a bag or a portfolio, have all those things on the left side of your body. And the reason why I say that is that when you get up, your right arm, your right hand is ready to shake the interviewer's hand should that time come eventually. And again, bringing it back to the Skype interviews in this time of social distancing, make sure there's not too much, again, going around behind you. Make sure there's not too much on your desk where your computer is or beside you or anything like that. Make sure everything looks neat and clean and okay to go. Of course, we don't want to take out our phone at this point. That thing should be off or at least on total silent, no vibrations or anything of that nature. At this point, we want to review our notes and get ready for the interview. Certainly, again, if you're taking one of those Skype calls, I'll probably leave your phone to the side if you're not using it for the actual call itself. Focus on the notes you took, the questions you want to ask, the questions you might have rehearsed or prepared for yourself, whatever it might be. And if they have you fill out any application, in person, make sure you fill out in ink, blue or black ink only. Nothing out there like pencils or Sharpies or anything like that. Blue or black ink is only what we want to use. So when we meet our interviews, typically, of course, we're going to give a firm handshake. If that's not the case, give a friendly hello over the Skype call if that is the case. Make sure you greet them confidently. So that means direct eye contact. Especially when it comes to some of those more telecommuting options. Some people have a lot of trouble, do I look at the camera? Should I look at them? I would say look at them on the screen. That's really what's going to give the best possible eye contact. It's not going to look like you're looking up because certainly that camera is above normal eye level in that Skype call. So look at them directly on the screen, not at the camera. And greeting confidently also means having a direct eye contact in addition to saying their name properly. If you got a chance to find out what their name was beforehand and you met them before over the phone, make sure you say their name correctly. If you're not sure how to do that, ask your friends and family, because I promise one of your friends and family will know how to properly announce their names. That last bit there obviously refers to a interview where it's more in person. So if that is the case, make sure you wait to sit until being offered a seat. That's an odd thing to hear, but most people usually have a sort of plan as to how the interview is going to go, and we don't want to mess up their plans or just be a little too rude or presumptuous by just, sitting down in the first seat we find. Wait for them to sort of offer, go sit anywhere or anything of that nature. All right, body language. And this is one that's actually super important even in this time of social distancing. Body language tells a lot about you to a person without you actually speaking, because it comes from your body. And so we want to avoid things like crossing our arms or kicking our leg in that nervousness, cracking our knuckles, clicking a pen, leaning back in a chair, any of these things that might indicate the wrong message. Certainly you can be saying all of the right things, but if your body doesn't match the tone of what you're saying, then it's really all for naught, because you're getting two different messages and they're getting a different message from you. So really, really make sure that your body language is in tune with what you're saying and is mimicking what the interviewer's body language is. And again, this comes into play even with things like a phone interview. Your body language is going to come through the tone of your voice. If you're taking a phone interview and you're in, your pajamas, you're on the couch, and you have your dog next to you, you're kind of leaning back, you're going to sound more relaxed over the phone, and they're going to get an idea of that body language solely from the tone of your voice. So whenever you have one of those, Skype calls or phone interviews or anything of that nature, make sure you're sitting upright in a chair at a desk in a separate room that's private to you, and treat it as if the person was right there in front of you. Some other things you want to keep in mind with body language, of course, eye contact is important. We don't want to do it all the time, though. We don't want to stare down the interviewer, whether it's over a computer or in person. That would just make it uncomfortable for the both of you. So make eye contact 2/3 of the time. And good times to make that eye contact, that 2/3, certainly when you first meet them, when they're talking about some of their favorite topics, or they're asking you a question, when you're starting to answer a question, you're talking about some of your favorite topics. But in between all those times, look around, show what you're thinking. Don't feel the need to constantly have your eyes fixated on theirs. We want to avoid touching your hair or face, especially right now, but generally as well, we want to avoid any of those nervous habits, playing with your hair, playing with your face, anything of that nature. Just avoid those altogether, just so you don't give off that sense of nervousness or you don't distract the interviewer otherwise. We also want to smile right, not all the time. Again, smiling the entire interview is probably not a good thing. It's probably going to, be a little, for lack of a better word, creepy for the interviewer, and we definitely want to watch that quite a bit. So smile in some different times. Again, smiling probably will fall along the same lines of the eye contact rules, but certainly when you meet them, when they're talking about favorite topics of yours or theirs, and when you're saying goodbye and leaving the interview, those are great times to smile. We do want to always look amiable and approachable, but we don't need to smile the entire time we're in that interview. Ultimately, however, you should be relaxed. You do want to take note of these things, but if you overanalyze every single last thing about yourself, you're not going to feel like yourself. So be yourself with these things in mind. Pay attention to those nervous habits you might have. And you're saying to yourself, well, Nick, I don't know what my nervous habits are. Ask your friends and family, because they do. So definitely, ask around and kind of watch that body language. Definitely practice how you might answer interview questions in a mirror, for example. You'll get a good idea of how you look when you're answering a question. Maybe if you need to change anything about your expression or your body language, that's a good time to kind of nail that right away. All right, so now we're getting into everyone's favorite topic, which is answering some of those tough interview questions. First and foremost, we're going to go over something called the STAR method. This is something you might have heard of before, but if not, I'll explain it right here outright. The STAR method, as you can see here, noted as situation, task, action, result, is a guideline of sorts for speaking and sometimes writing, but in this case, speaking, particularly directed toward the interview, especially when it comes to those behavioral interview questions. Think about how many times you've heard, tell me about a time you overcame an obstacle. Tell me about a time you've worked on a team. Tell me about a time you failed. Tell me about a time you succeeded. Tell me about a time forces you to tell a story. You can't just answer it black and white. You have to tell a job-specific story to answer that question in many cases. And every good story has a beginning, a middle, an end, and outline. And that's what STAR is going to be. It's going to be our outline to our story. So let's just take this as an example. So let's just say, for example, I get asked that interview question, tell me about a time you overcame an obstacle. So I can think to myself, okay, obstacle, that's going to be my situation. One day my manager called out a new hire orientation. That's my situation. Then I get to task and action. And a lot of people tend to confuse the two because they sound very similar. The distinction is task is the thing that needs to be done. Action is the steps that you took. So in my example, my manager called out on the day of new hire orientation. My task is a new hire orientation needs to be managed, and my action is I decide to tag another coworker in, and they and I manage new hire orientation together. And the result is a direct result from my action. Even when we're talking about teamwork and all this fun stuff, we really want to focus on what we did as a part of that team. Certainly, cooperation and teamwork are important skills to have, but they're not hiring your team from your company or your teammate. They're hiring you, hopefully. So you really want to focus on what you did, the result of your action. So my manager called out on the day of new hire orientation situation. New hire orientation needed to be managed. Task. I decided to grab another coworker and manage new orientation with them. And at the end of the day, my manager was very pleased with the results of new hire orientation. The new hires scored very highly on our surveys, and everyone was happy, whatever it might be. That's how the STAR method works. Now, is a STAR method an end-all, be-all? Is it gospel? Is it something you have to do every single time someone asks you an interview question? Not at all. The STAR method is simply a jumping off point, a springboard, especially if you get caught in that deer in the headlights moment we talked about earlier. So let's look at some questions. The first one, which is one of the more popular ones, is tell me about yourself. When the interviewer asks you this, how do you want to respond to this? Well, ideally, we need to talk about your professional background, and a quick synopsis describes your work experience, your education, and in particular, what brought you to this new position. Now, there may be less positive reasons as to why you're interviewing again. That's really not what we're hitting on here. More so what we're hitting on is why are we attracted to this company? What interests us about this position? What are we looking for out of this company? That's really what we want to focus on. And this is mostly an icebreaker question, but if we can't answer it this way with all these details into it, it's going to really start the interview on a really good foot for us as the interviewee. Sometimes interviewers do push this envelope and get to know a little more about you and say, oh, well, tell me about your hobbies. What do you like to do outside of work? Certainly that's okay to answer. We just want to make sure that our answers are workplace appropriate and we keep them pretty brief and get right back to the interview. So we don't need to go into super detail about everything we do. Just a generic couple of words. I like reading, I like writing, I like running, I like exercising, I like swimming, I like skiing, whatever. Keep it very brief. Make sure those hobbies are something you can tell your coworkers, for example, something that, is appropriate to say in that time. And again, now's not the time to have that whole autobiography. Certainly, hopefully that comes later. But keep it brief. Let them get back to the interview. Next, another very popular question is, what's your greatest weakness? A very difficult question for all of us to answer. It's hard to kind of pin down what our weaknesses are. So let's look at how we want to answer this question. So a lot of words up here, but there's 4 main words I want you to pick out from each bullet point here. Accurate, 5 words, red flag, cliche, and grow. So first and foremost, we want to pick an accurate weakness. They're not looking to see if we're a perfect person. Certainly no one is perfect. We're looking to see if we know what our weaknesses are and what we can do about them. So we're going to pick an accurate weakness to us. We also don't want to pick a weakness that will raise any red flags. Let's say, for example, in my position, they asked me, hey, Nick, what's your greatest weakness? And I said public speaking. I probably wouldn't get my job because my job revolves around public speaking. So you really want to make sure you watch, what weaknesses you're picking. Are they going to raise a red flag in the interview based on the position or the company? If so, then definitely do not want to use those. We also want to watch some of those cliche or reused weaknesses or weaknesses portrayed as strength. The most popular two are I'm a perfectionist or I work too hard. First and foremost, these are not really weaknesses per se. They are more so you're trying to mask a strength as a weakness, which is really not what they're looking for at all. As I mentioned, they're sort of looking for you to have that self-awareness about you and the ability to address that, weaknesses within yourself. And also these two in particular and a few others in this sort of bucket are very cliche and well overused to the point where many times when this is heard for a recruiter, it usually makes their eyes roll. So make sure you don't use any of these things. Pick something that is specific to you. And the most important bit here is talking about what you've been doing to grow with this weakness. How have you been addressing this weakness in your time? What can you do about it? That's really what they're looking for in particular when it comes to these weaknesses. Okay, so why did you leave your most recent position? Within the context of CareerLink, I want to answer this in 2 different areas. First and foremost, you were laid off. So how can we go about that? Well, We want to be matter of fact but not apologetic. Again, a layoff is not the most positive of situations, but now during the interview is not the time to get into some of those more negative emotions. Now is not the time to engage in that. So be matter of fact, talk about what you've learned from the past job, talk about what you gained from it and all that fun stuff. And make sure you're positive and watch your body language. Again, you can be positive in your language, but if your body language doesn't match that, they're going to get that message either way. So make sure you're really watching your body language at all times with this. The other situation is if you were fired, how do we want to go about that? Well, first and foremost, call the HR department at your former company and ask what they would say in a reference check. They might not give you this information, but they also might give it to you. And a lot of people have it in their heads that companies cannot tell other companies as to why a person was fired. A lot of people think that is illegal. That's not illegal. Companies can tell each other why someone was fired. However, most companies choose to relegate this information to, is this person eligible for rehire, yes or no? And that's really what they leave it at because they're worried about possibly getting sued for libel or slander. So I always say, just take the chance, ask the HR department, see what they might say, and make sure your stories match up. But ultimately, if you don't get an answer or you can't get an answer, be honest and discuss what you learned from that experience. Make sure you're talking about how you grew from that experience, if you were fired, and talk about what you have done better since then, how you've really addressed some of those weaknesses you had that caused you to being terminated. Another big question is, why is there a gap in your work history? This question, ironically, is going to function very similarly to the weakness question. Because what you're going to do is talk about your gaps accurately, but also talk about what you've been doing to develop during these times. There are a lot of different reasons as to why someone may have had a gap in the past. But we don't want to go into an interview and just simply say, well, I was just looking for work that entire time. We really want to display our value a little bit better. So talk about things you're doing outside of job searching. Were you volunteering? Were you going to classes? Were you taking online classes? Were you upskilling yourself somehow? Were you networking? Were you going to a professional organization? Anything of that nature. Talk about all those other things you're doing. That's really what's going to pique their interest more than hearing, I was just job searching. For something like a medical injury or issue, make sure you assure the interviewer that that time is now over. You have no further serious concerns about that medical issue. Okay, so the other question we said we would get back to is the question of salary or wage. What are you seeking? If they ask you this, of course, this is the time you refer to your salary research and give that range to present to the interviewer. And your range might look something akin to this. Now, typically, a range is going to be just the minimum number and the high number, as we see here. Why do we add that third number in there? Well, the reason why I say you always add a middle number and average number into your range is particularly for the job application itself. So this is almost working our way back a little bit from the point of interviews. But a lot of times nowadays, job applications will have that question right there on the application. They have you fill in the box. And sometimes you can only put in one value. You can't put in a range into this box. So if you ever come across that, the value you want to put in that box is the middle number. But going back to the point of interviewing, typically you're going to give them the low number and the high number. So if I'm going to ask, what's your range you're looking for, I can say $27,000 to $37,000. That's my range there. And again, as I mentioned before, make sure this range is realistic to show that it's researched, but not too broad so it's all over the place. Make sure it is specific and broad enough to be negotiated with. All right, do you have any questions for me? The answer to this question is always yes. If you don't ask questions, it may make you seem uninterested or otherwise unprepared for the interview. And asking questions has a lot of great benefits for you as well, to learn more about the company, about the position. You can really get a good idea of what the company's culture is like, and even a chance to highlight some of your other skills. And of course, as we mentioned beforehand, avoid asking questions that can be answered by a simple Google search, a simple run through of their website, anything of that nature, any yes or no questions. We want questions that only company employees are able to answer, or that would take some time to answer at least. And some examples of good questions to ask your interviewers. For example, one is you can ask, what is training like for the position? You can ask, how will my performance be measured? How will I be tracked in my job? What is the company culture like? To caveat that question in particular, if culture isn't exactly the right word for your field, especially if you are in a field that is, works in a factory or warehouse or facility of that nature. You can always change this by saying, what is the workplace environment like? What's a typical day like here? You don't always have to use that word culture there. You can ask them what challenges or obstacles they see, as well as, asking them specifically what their favorite part of working for the company is. Certainly this is a great question to ask because everyone knows themselves better than anyone else. Some people like talking about themselves. So if you get an interviewer talking about themselves for, 10, 20 minutes, they might leave with a better memory of that interview because they got to talk about themselves all of that time. So it's a great way to, not only learn more, but also kind of bring them more into the interview because now they're getting a chance to speak more about themselves and less about you. And typically, when it comes to these questions, I only ask a good about 3 to 5 questions. We don't want to answer or ask too many questions and drag the interview on longer than it needs to be. There is one question, however, I always ask at the end, no matter what, and that is, what are the next steps in the interview process? The reason why I do this is, for one, it signals to the interviewer that my questioning period is now over. This is the last question. I don't need to tell them that out directly. There are too many times I've seen in interviews in my career where people will say, all my questions are done. And they kind of leave it off that awkward ending there. So that's an issue right there in its own right. It also tells the interviewer that you're still very much engaged as to what's going on with this interview process. So certainly, think about what questions you're going to ask. These are general questions that can be used in any company. So you also want to combine these with those questions you'll write down from your research. Definitely look into that handout because there's going to be a lot more questions in that handout you can possibly ask. Definitely refer to that handout for further questions and ideas of questions you could ask during an interview. And one thing I'll say too is, before we move on from this topic, is make sure you bring extra questions asked during an interview. A lot of people will say, well, what if all of my questions are answered during the interview? That shouldn't hopefully happen if you brought, more than 10 questions with you. So it's the end of the interview. You're probably red as a lobster because you're all nervous, but now everything's over. Make sure you ask them for a business card or some form of contact information, as this is going to help us with follow-up, particularly after the interview. So after the interview, the main form of follow-up we're going to be doing is the thank you email. Thank you emails, and emails specifically, are extremely important to the interview process. It's something that we should do within 24 hours of that interview. So for example, if I had an interview on Thursday at 11, before Friday at 11, my thank you email should be sent out. And this email is meant to not only remind them that we were there the day before, but also thank them for their time. And what will this email look like in particular? Well, we want to thank every interviewer for taking the time to interview, especially making that personal to each interviewer. We want to talk again about our interest in the position and the company. Kind of reiterate some of the things we said in the interview earlier that day or the day prior. Also restate some of our skills or values and make sure we are talking about these things in more confident terms. I know I have this skill. I know I have this value, so on and so forth. I know I'm a good fit. All that fun stuff. And make sure that every email is personal to the interviewer. Like I said, you want to thank every interviewer in particular. So you are interviewed by 4 people, you should have 4 separate emails. You don't want to send out one mass email to 4 different people. Each email should have a different bit of personal touch for each of them. Think of what questions they asked you, what answers they gave you, topics you both talked about, and that's how you can sort of differentiate it between each person. And on the screen here, you can see an example of a thank you email. We can see it's a very short email. It's not something that's too long. It hits all these major points in just a couple sentences. It's not really there in particular. So this is essentially what it's going to look like on there. And as well, in that packet, with this guideline being somewhat glossed over, there's a much more specific guideline and another example in that packet to give you more ideas as how to write a thank you email. Okay, so the last thing we're going to be talking about today is something called the Rule of 2 with follow-up. So let's just say, for example, your interviewer says, hey, we're going to let you know of our decision within 5 business days. Let's say that business day ends up being a Friday. We're going to let you know by Friday. And you say, great, cool, can't wait. You wait the 5 business days, Friday comes, it's 5:01, and there's no answer. Do you think you should pick up the phone, start calling, or start emailing them? Probably not. So what you want to do is wait a couple of business days, maybe 2 or 3 business days after that answer does not come, and then send another follow-up email. Now, to say follow-up phone call up there, if you did want to do phone calls, you're comfortable with that, that's perfectly fine. Most interviewers prefer a follow-up email. If that's how you've been typically communicating, I would stick it to that way. But I do get a lot of people telling me they like making follow-up phone calls. They think it makes them a little more personal. Certainly, I recommend the email, but if that's been working for you, please keep doing that. It's perfectly fine. After that, what we want to do is wait a couple another business days, another 2 to 3 business days or so, and if they have no answer after that, then we can send another of those follow-up emails, follow-up phone calls, telling them that we're still interested in the position, we're still eagerly awaiting their decision, things of that nature. Other than that, keep going. Don't over-contact an interviewer. We don't want to become a badger or a nuisance to them, because maybe they were planning on getting back to us, but then we contacted them, 20 times within 1 week, and now we're too much of a nuisance to get back to. But, you never know what might have happened. Maybe someone had to reschedule an interview. Maybe, something happened that was catastrophic within their business. Anything of that nature. Especially right now, with this time of social distancing, a lot of people are probably still figuring out how they're working particularly. So definitely give them some leeway when it comes to it. Continue your job search. Continue applying. Continue interviewing. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Even if you think you killed the interview and they liked you, you liked them, you thought you were shoo-in, maybe someone came in the next day or even the next hour who was just a hair better, and that's all it took to knock you off that pedestal. So, you never know. Don't over-contact. Stick to the rule of 2 there. Those 2 follow-up emails or follow-up phone calls you might make, and that's it after that thank you email. Otherwise, continue your job search. But that's everything we talked about today with interviews. I hope this class helped you in some way, shape, or form. Again, please refer to the packet for even more information or a reiteration of all of this information. And otherwise, stay safe, stay healthy, and keep on keeping on.